Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to wait a few more minutes, so just in about 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Sarah Morris. I'm from the Environment and Climate Change Unit at the IEA. And this webinar is to present a paper that's just been published online today, so you can look at that as we are doing the webinar as well, on real-world policy packages for sustainable energy transition. That's trying to explore some themes on how to shape energy transition policies to fit national objectives and constraints. Unfortunately, Christina Hood is unable to join us today. She's unwell and could not join, but colleagues Peter.Janoska and Caroline Lee will be presenting the paper. So without further ado, I'll let them get started. They'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we can address questions. Do feel free to ask questions as they're speaking if there's questions that come to mind during the presentation. So first will be Peter. He will give a bit of an introduction and present the first 2 parts of the paper, and then we'll be moving on to Caroline, who will be presenting the case study that's in the paper. So over to you, Peter.
Many thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter.Janoska. I'm from the Environment and Climate Change team of the IEA, as introduced, and I'm going to provide an introduction to the paper and present some of its first parts. So why are we talking about sustainable energy transition? We see that around the world, many countries are embarking on transitions to sustainable energy systems, and others are already well underway. And these transitions will be complex, involving fundamentally interrelated changes in technologies, fuels, infrastructure policies, markets, etc. Through the paper, we aim to provide a initial exploration of key elements of policy packages for sustainable energy transitions and their applications in different time horizons. So first, we try to look at the question of what are the key elements of the policy packages, and secondly, look at what are the key shaping factors for these packages. And we see that there is a strong shaping by multiple and varying national objectives that take into account various constraints that governments face too. So this report has 3 key parts. The first part unpacks the key elements of the policy packages and provides a conceptual framework and research base to explain the role of policy packages. The second part provides a in-depth analysis of one of the key constraints on policymaking and the potential short-term difficulty in implementing ambitious carbon pricing. And the third part focuses on a case study of Canada. So firstly, why do we talk about policy packages? We talk about policy packages because we see that we end up with policy mixes due to the broad range of policy objectives. We know that energy sector actions are critical for achieving greenhouse gas reduction targets. And from a climate perspective, one might see all these policies as interchangeable ways to reduce emissions. But from an energy policymaker's perspective, greenhouse gas targets are not the only or even the primary driver of energy sector actions. Energy sector policies and actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions may be motivated primarily by wider benefits such as energy security or building experience with the new technologies, cutting air pollution, or reduces energy bills. With greenhouse gas emissions reductions coming only as a secondary benefit. The second main reason for policy packages is that given the complexity of the energy system transitions, no single policy can be a silver bullet. Policy packages are needed to achieve a whole-scale shift in energy systems in all subsectors. Within the energy sectors, one can frame the elements of policy packages for the energy transition as falling within three key domains, which we sort of rank on the short-term policy cost perspective. Firstly, we have the negative cost opportunities, particularly in energy end-use sectors such as transport and buildings. Consumers often face non-economic barriers in their decision-making. As such, there is significant scope to unlock the cost-effective opportunities and reduce emissions through incentives that drive improved energy use, such as targeted energy efficiency policies. Then moderate cost opportunities, which are based on optimal energy pricing. Optimal energy pricing and the efficient market conditions has the potential to play a key role in energy system transformation. And investor confidence in rising fewer carbon prices can drive investment in low carbon alternatives in power and industry, as well as the phase out of high carbon polluting assets. If high carbon prices are absent or remain only at moderate levels, complementary policies such as standards, regulations, or other incentives could be there in place to achieve these outcomes. And the third key domain is the domain of high cost short-term investment for longer-term returns type of domain, where governments can shift the boundary of what emission reductions are achievable by supporting the underpinning infrastructure in markets such as EV charging networks, reforming electricity market design, or investing in technology research and development and demonstration and deployment to unlock deeper mitigation potential on a large scale. And while these interventions can require additional upfront investment, they can bring down the long-term cost of energy transitions. It is, however, important to stress that all three domains are needed in the package, and it isn't sequential starting with the cheapest, but all these options need to be explored at the same time. So moving on to looking at how do we integrate these policy objectives and constraints in the real world policy packages. We see that the energy system transition consistent with the collective goals of the Paris Agreement implies considerable greenhouse gas emissions reductions, with peaking by around 2020 and rapid reductions thereafter. I show the key element of the transition to the real energy system. But in the real world, there is no single energy transition policy package that fits all countries. national policy objectives and constraints will shape each jurisdiction's specific policy mix. It is therefore important to look at and consider that the transition is not just about the decarbonization challenges, but in addition to greenhouse gas emission reductions around the world, we need to take into account broad range of objectives, including air pollution, enhancing access to clean energy, while maintaining economic competitiveness and energy security. And the range of objectives pursued by governments and the prioritization over time will shape the scope and the depth of the sustainable energy policies. It is also important to bear in mind that real-world policy decisions often face numerous constraints, and economic competitiveness and distributional impact questions will be key in this regard. For instance, in many countries, introduction of carbon pricing can visibly increase energy prices and therefore imply implementation challenges. In other countries, as a result of historical or economic structures, industry and power sectors can have a considerable political influence over the legislative process. But this is just to say that there is no single policy package, and policy packages will often move into the domain of a second best because of the impact of the objectives and constraints that are there. To add to this already complex picture, we also need to consider the time dimension of policy objectives. And another important consideration for policy packages in this regard is the need for longer-term transition. And this graph from a study produced by the French government shows that the most cost-effective mix of policies to meet an emissions target for transport in 2030 on the left is very different to the one that we would see for the long-term transition of a mid-century. We see that what is ideal shifts a great deal depending on the time horizons. So if we just want a short-term cost optimization, there is a lot of efficiency. If the goal is for a longer-term transformation, much greater attention is needed on technologies like electrification of transport. We have tried to unpack this very practical example in the paper, and we try to provide an analysis of what an ideal policy package would look like across different time frames. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this figure. This is just to give you whet your appetite to read the paper. But just to say that policies are needed to seize both immediate greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities, primarily in the first and second domains described earlier, while putting in place steps for longer-term transition in the third domain. So policies with a short impact include support for the deployment of energy efficiency and mature clean technologies, while preparing for the future would involve paying attention to investment patterns, providing support for early stage clean energy technology deployment, developing a strategic approach to underpinning infrastructure and investment in technology R&D, such as battery technologies and advanced biofuels. So again, a variety of policy mixes can achieve these same objectives, but a policy package that aims to deliver shorter-term goals without taking into account longer-term transition needs might leave the energy sector ill-prepared for the future. And with that, I would like to move on to talk about our next part of the paper. The first part described why complex policy packages are required to deliver sustainable energy transition. And over the years, the IEA has built an extensive modeling capacity to unpack the complexity of the energy sector transition and devise pathways for the transitions. And the resulting model scenarios envisage the use of high carbon prices, which drive a considerable part of the technological and behavioral changes needed. At the same time, they show that a high carbon price alone does not address all aspects of the energy sector transition, and comprehensive policy packages are needed. I'll go into some detail on what do we find as a key element of these policy packages if we have a moderate carbon prices, based on some of the earlier IEA modeling scenarios. So in the IEA World Energy Outlook scenarios, the baseline, the new policy scenarios includes, which already includes the Paris Agreement, national determined contributions, sees carbon prices in the range of $10 to $30 in 2030 and 20 to 50 in 2040, depending on the regions. In a scenario consistent with keeping the temperature rise to 2 degrees, prices are $100 to $100 in 2030, rising to $140 in 2040. And while these scenarios are from a 2015 report, so not the very latest IEA's carbon price numbers, we do use these scenarios because they give a better demonstration of effect of a carbon price than some of the latest analysis. So, and also because to me the recent global trends in carbon pricing as well as short to medium term outlook beg the question, if we do not currently foresee prices of $100 by 2030, what is it that the more moderate prices achieve, or what do they not achieve, and what other policies might be needed to provide the guardrails to keep emission reductions on track. So as a part of this study, we've been working on trying to understand how to form energy climate policy packages that keep 2 degrees pathway within reach with the sorts of carbon prices that are realistically foreseen and in the short to medium term, instead of those that the models tell us we need, and enhanced understanding of the specific roles of carbon pricing can really shed light on the policy gaps that could arise if it is not politically feasible to raise carbon prices significantly in the short to medium term, and port towards real world policy packages that target these outcomes in the meantime. But let's look at the results. So we mainly approach this question by looking at a bridge scenario, differences between the bridge scenario and the 450 scenario. And this scenario has the same moderate carbon prices as the baseline new policy scenarios, but it adds targeted energy policies like support for energy efficiency and renewable energy, as well as phase out of fossil fuel subsidies that act in a short term to deliver immediate emission savings and peak global emissions before 2020. To go from the bridge scenario to the 2 degree scenario of 450, the main policy difference is then a high carbon price as well as early support for advanced technologies. So we asked the question as to what the set of targeted energy policies of the bridge scenario could achieve and what couldn't achieve without the high carbon prices of the 450 scenario. So we find that the bridge scenario's sort of short-term interventions manages to keep nearly emissions nearly on track with those of the 450 scenarios early into the early 2020s, demonstrating the tremendous opportunity here for the cost-effective early action. However, the gap between the two scenarios nearly doubled between the 2030 to 2030 compared with 2015 to 2030, which points that the steep cuts in emissions achieved beyond 2030 rely on high carbon prices, but also on early actions geared for long term. So, for instance, investing in emerging technologies in the short term may only pay off a decade or more after early commercial pilots were initialized. This strengthens the rationale for implementing combinations of complementary policies in the short term that pave the way for future greater ambition. Obviously, this is a picture for the energy sector as a whole, and in the report we unpack these key opportunities and key results on a sectoral level, and we try to analyze what role does the carbon price play in driving further emission reductions in a power, industry, and transport. I'm not going to look at all the sectors, but I'm going to briefly talk about some of the key findings from the power and the transport sector to show you very different drivers. So looking at the results from the power sector, we can see that if we look at the new investments as in this graph, we see that the committed emissions from new build in a bridge scenario are very similar to the 2 degrees of scenario 450. So we can see that a set of energy policies in the bridge does a really good job of guiding new investment decisions in a period to 2025. And there is no real difference between the investment patterns in a bridge and a 450. So while a carbon price can steer new investment, targeted policies can also do a very good job on this. But from a policy perspective, this then suggests that if the high carbon prices of the 450 scenario are not feasible, new investment in power generation could be kept on a track through direct support policies such as auctions for new capacity, feed-in tariffs, or green certificates, which is a strategy that has already successfully been followed by many governments. But as an additional point, it's important to bear in mind that for renewables and nuclear power, price is only one factor enabling deployment, and there are other elements such as project mandates for the nuclear power that play a role here. Just not to oversimplify the picture. But in the power sector, where we see that the bridge scenario does a terrible job is in terms of existing plants. A major difference between the 450 and a bridge that points to a key result of the high carbon price is the level of unabated fossil fuel generation in 2040. China's coal power fleet, which is depicted in this figure, in the two scenarios, provides a striking example of this fact. In the 450 scenario on the right, the high carbon price leads to around 1/3 of plants being retired and another 1/3 retrofitted with CCS. with more moderate prices on the bridge scenario, we simply don't see it happening. And coal capacity remains steady out to 2040. Policies in a bridge scenario that promote efficiency and renewables and limit construction and use of inefficient coal lead to stalling of growth in coal capacity by 2020, while high carbon prices after 2025 drive more substantive change. This points to the two areas where ETS may need to be supported by the policies until carbon prices get to a higher level. This is firstly the timely phase out of existing high carbon assets, and Canada and the UK both already have a phase out policies along these lines, and the secondly the rollout of innovative technologies such as CCS, where we are globally far behind where we need to be. To move on, I'm going to briefly touch upon an additional example that which we show, and that's carbon pricing in a role in the transport sector, where it plays a very different role to the power and industry, for instance. And the transport sector is the second largest emitter after power generation, with about a quarter of energy-related CO2 emissions. So very important to also bear in mind. We see that in 2040, 75% of transportation remains road-based, which is an important element to consider when designing policies, and therefore it holds still great abatement potential in 2040 and beyond. We find that pricing in the transport sector can play a synergistic role by supporting by moderating demand. It can compensate for rebound effects, but carbon pricing itself cannot unlock more substantial technology shifts such as electrification, advanced biofuel development, and other large-scale investments for transport infrastructure. We see that fuel economy standards are the main driver of short to medium-term emission reductions in a bridge scenario, which will need to be strengthened further in the 450, which taps into greater mitigation potential with electric vehicles and biofuel development accelerating between the bridge and scenario and the 450. As large shifts in the transport systems will not be triggered by the moderate prices in the short term, that we therefore need a further governmental action, such as vehicle performance standards, low fuel mandates, R&D support, etc. I'm going to leave it in here with respect to the looking at the IEA model scenarios, but the conclusion that we reached is that within the IEA's low carbon scenario, the steep cuts in emissions needed after 2030 point to the importance of both short-term policy actions and long-term support for ambitious technologies that can be delivered through technology innovation. And the role of the carbon price across different subsectors differs very much based on their price sensitivity. And while it can incentivize large share opportunities in the power generation and industry, it only plays a supporting role in a transport and building sector. With this, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Caroline to present the Canada case study.
Thanks, Peter. In this third section of the webinar, I would like to really take a deeper look at how policy packages in a particular national context have been shaped So I'll present the case study of Canada and look at really how the national circumstances in Canada have created challenges, but also created opportunities for the development of its very interesting low carbon policy package. First, I'd like to give a little bit of context as to Canada's energy sector picture for those of you who are not as familiar. Canada is the highest energy producer per capita across IEA member countries. It is the 5th in terms of global oil production and 4th highest gas producer globally. The energy sector plays a very important role in Canada's economy and in terms of employment. It contributes about 10% to the country's GDP, employs about 270,000 people, and in 2016 was responsible for about 1/5 of Canada's manufacturing exports. Canada's primary energy mix is fossil fuel based. About 3/4 of primary energy mix in Canada is made up of oil and gas. However, when we look at the electricity sector, we really see an inverse picture of this, where over 3/4 of Canada's electricity generation actually comes from low carbon sources, namely 60% coming from hydro and 16% coming from nuclear. A second important element of Canada's energy context is that there's really a strong regional diversity when it comes to the energy sector across provinces, across subnational jurisdictions. And you can see that here as represented in this chart that shows the electricity generation mix across provinces and territories. And it's clear that there are some provinces that rely primarily on fossil-based resources, as you can see indicated by coal in the brown, natural gas in the purple. And there are other provinces that where hydropower in particular plays quite a large role in the electricity generation mix. So again, if you look at the energy sector and particularly electricity generation across provinces, there's quite a varied picture there. There's also quite a strong level of diversity in terms of political priorities and in terms of economic structure as well. So what does this mean in terms of Canada's low carbon policy package? There are really two defining features of the Canadian case that I would highlight in this presentation today. First, it's the fact that there is a shared jurisdiction on low carbon and energy policy between federal and subnational governments. Now, Canada is governed as a federation, which means the federal government and subnational governments each have defined jurisdictional responsibilities that are defined according to Canada's constitution. Canada's federation is relatively decentralized, which means that the 13 subnational jurisdictions, known as provinces and territories, they have a relatively large amount of authority over a range of issues, including energy resources, which provinces and territories, they formally own and manage. The federal government has jurisdiction, however, over interprovincial energy and environmental affairs, as well as offshore energy resources. So in practice, there really is a shared responsibility between these two levels of government over policy that drives low carbon energy transition. As I mentioned, there's also a high regional variability when it comes to energy resources, economic structure, and also political priorities. And so partly enabled by the first two factors, it's really the subnational governments that have largely, that have been the first movers on implementing low carbon energy transition policy. And it's the subnational governments that have largely defined the existing low carbon policy landscape. A second defining feature of the Canadian case is that there is quite a complex mix of policies now that exist under the Canadian low carbon and climate strategy known as the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So policies themselves, they have implemented a suite of low carbon energy policies which are layered over top of these are federal policies. I'll mention that the election of a new federal government in 2015 meant that the federal government was interested in taking a stronger role in developing low carbon energy policy across the country. So really that means that there's quite a complex suite of both federal and subnational policies. The Pan-Canadian Framework, very notably, has greenhouse gas emissions reductions as one important objective, but it is certainly not the only one. Priorities in Canada's low carbon transition include also job creation, enhanced economic competitiveness, including for low carbon sectors, just transition for affected workers and sectors, and improved air quality. The Pan-Canadian Framework also lays out specific regional objectives for particular regions and populations, including northern, remote, and Indigenous communities. Now, in order to achieve these energy transition objectives, a carbon price has been established as a central component of Canada's policy package. This policy is designed as a backstop policy, meaning that some national jurisdictions that do not meet an established benchmark will have a federal backstop price implemented. This would take the form of a carbon levy or a tax, and for large final emitters, it would entail the application of an output-based, intensity-based, tradable performance standard, largely to help facilitate the transition for these sectors. So this would be a policy that would be implemented, again, only for jurisdictions that do not meet a minimum standard. But beyond the central carbon price, there is an entire suite of other policies that have been implemented or proposed by the federal government and subnational governments. At the federal level, these include an accelerated phase-out of coal-fired power, strengthened vehicle emission standards, a proposed clean fuel standard, renewable fuels regulations, and also quite a few policies supporting technology and innovation. So I'll go through each of those points then in turn. Firstly, on the point of shared jurisdiction over low carbon policy, there have been both benefits and costs, as I mentioned, to policy being driven by subnational governments in Canada. Certainly, the clear benefit is that policy packages have been able to be tailored to local and regional circumstances. Also, this has allowed the low carbon energy transition agenda to advance in the absence of federal drivers. But this has also resulted in what has been referred to as a policy patchwork, and also creates risks, including inconsistent policy signals across the country, which could be problematic, especially for businesses that are operating in multiple jurisdictions. This creates differing carbon price signals. Some provinces have carbon prices currently, some provinces don't. And as a result, economic efficiency is sacrificed in reducing emissions at the country scale. And as I mentioned, there are gaps in policy ambition. So some jurisdictions are quite advanced in implementing low carbon policy, and some jurisdictions less so. So this has presented quite an interesting challenge for the federal government, because as I said, the provinces being first movers on implementing low carbon policy, there is already quite a rich landscape of low carbon policies across the country. The challenge for the federal government is that it wanted to take a stronger role in implementing low carbon energy transition policy while balancing concerns of policy duplication and also respecting subnational authority in the energy and low carbon domains. So the example of the federal backstop carbon price that's detailed in the Pan-Canadian framework provides one example of an approach to seeking this balance, again, between federal coordination and subnational autonomy authority. Firstly, the backstop carbon price, as I mentioned, it only applies to jurisdictions that do not meet a benchmark. So for those who do meet a benchmark for carbon pricing, they can continue along their own carbon pricing systems. The revenues of a federally imposed carbon price, or the backstop carbon price policy, they would be fully returned to jurisdictions. So this addresses any concerns of wealth redistribution across the country. In terms of the specific policy design features, many of those are left up to the individual provinces and territories. And lastly, the carbon price and generally the Pan-Canadian framework is silent on individual jurisdictions' contributions to the national target. So they don't say how much each individual region needs to reduce overall, or again, how much they need to contribute to the national goal. But at the same time, while this backstop carbon price does respect the autonomy of individual subnational jurisdictions, it does raise the minimum ambition level, and it does create a level of harmonization and cohesion in terms of carbon pricing across the country. Secondly, I'd like to talk about this feature of complementing a central carbon price with other policies in the Canadian context. So as Peter mentioned, the benefits of carbon pricing are really well known. They're numerous. It is the most cost-efficient means of achieving emissions reductions. It allows flexibility in responding to increased fossil fuel prices. It creates revenues that can be used for a range of purposes, and certainly at high enough levels, it's effective in driving economy-wide emissions reductions to meet GHG emissions reductions targets. However, in the real world, there is a need for other policies in various circumstances. So firstly, there's a need for other policies where carbon prices do not act effectively. And this addresses the first domain that Peter mentioned earlier on in the presentation, where market barriers prevent carbon prices from acting effectively. And this is most notable in the area of energy efficiency improvements, where the lack of information, misaligned incentives, and also lack of access to capital, for example, mean that targeted policies to address these non-economic barriers are needed. In Canada, examples of these types of policies would be the National Model Building Code, which will be strengthened in the future, as well as appliance energy efficiency standards. Policies are also needed to complement a carbon price in driving technology innovation. And again, Peter mentioned this earlier. These types of policies may not result in short-term emissions reductions, but they're necessary to bring down the cost of energy transition, particularly in the long term. And Canada has recently announced an array of support, both in the financial and research capacity building sense, for supporting clean energy technology innovation. And lastly, even if in theory carbon prices can function in many sectors and serve to drive decarbonization across the economy, where they stand now at moderate levels and where there is limited visibility in the long term, there's a role for other policies to strengthen that. So for example, we see that in the power sector, low to moderate carbon prices have been shown to be able to drive the dispatch of coal versus gas. but it hasn't been able to drive the premature retirement of coal-fired power plants, which is precisely what the coal phase-out policy, one that Canada recently announced the acceleration of, is what it would achieve. Furthermore, the coal phase-out policy has a time frame of 2030, which goes beyond the 2022 carbon price time frame, which allows, again, more policy visibility in the long term. I will mention as well, though, that if carbon prices manage to be maintained or certainly strengthened over time, then this may leave less of a role for other backstopping policies. I would now like to take the last couple of slides to focus on one illustration of a sectoral policy package in Canada looking at the transport sector. The paper itself also examines the power sector, which I won't present here. But in Canada's transport sector, an array of policies exist, which you see in the table in front of you, noting, of course, that this isn't an exhaustive list of policies in the transport sector. And notably, there are different policies that each serve different functions or serve different objectives. So for instance, in vehicle emission standards in Canada, they set a flexible emissions intensity to be met by manufacturers, the primary objective of which is to improve fuel efficiency. The federal government has also implemented a renewable fuels regulation, which requires transportation fuel suppliers to meet a certain minimum percentage of renewable content in the fuels. In addition to this, the federal government has also proposed a clean fuel standard. So this would actually require a declining emissions intensity of fuels, covering fuels actually beyond biofuels, so beyond the renewable fuels regulation, to include electricity, hydrogen, and also include sectors beyond transport, which is what the renewable fuels regulation would cover, to include industry and buildings. There's also support for transit and active transportation. Urban planning helps shift to cleaner modes of transportation. And it can also reduce demand for vehicle distance traveled through densification and mixed use development. So notably, the Clean Fuel Standard and the Renewable Fuel Standard, their aim is primarily to drive cleaner fuel supply without creating significant incentives to reduce fuel use or to use alternative modes of transport. So this reinforces the role of measures such as vehicle emission standards, such as public transit support and urban and land use planning. And then lastly, we have a carbon price, which is intended to drive changes across the sector, including lowering demand, which it does more effectively in the long term than in the short, fuel switching, and also modal shift. So really, the main takeaway from this slide is that there are a number of policies. They do cover, in some sense, the same emissions, but they each serve different functions. That said, attention must be paid to policy interactions, as there's a risk that overlapping policies could undermine one another. So a couple of examples again from the transport sector, the proposed Clean Fuel Standard, which would, again, as I mentioned, mandate a specific carbon intensity for fuels across the country, across various sectors. It would cover the same emission sources as the existing renewable fuels regulations, which specify a minimum renewable fuel content, specifically biofuels content. So notably, these renewable fuels regulations exist at the federal level and also are implemented by individual provinces. And they could risk increasing the cost of meeting the Clean Fuel Standard. Provincial renewable fuels regulations mandate specifically the uptake of biofuels and in specific jurisdictions, even if it might be cheaper to meet the Clean Fuel Standard using other measures, such as increasing the use of electricity in transport or even increasing the use of biofuels in jurisdictions that don't have renewable fuels regulations. The same could be said about provincial clean fuel standards. There are also examples of policies that can undermine the cost effectiveness of the Clean Fuel Standard itself. But on the flip side, the Clean Fuel Standard could also raise the cost of complying with other policies by interacting with, for instance, provincial carbon pricing policies. If we look, for example, at industrial emitters, they would be covered by the Clean Fuel Standard, but also by the output-based performance standard as defined in the federal backstop carbon price. The Clean Fuel Standard would place a specific obligation on fuel suppliers to reduce the emissions intensity of fuels in particular, which may be costlier reductions compared to other measures to reduce industrial emissions intensity, such as, for instance, improving the energy efficiency of industrial processes. So again, policy packages are needed to meet multiple objectives, as shown in the previous slide. And policies, even if they are overlapping, can complement one another by serving different functions. But it's important to keep in mind that there is a risk of them undermining one another as well. And the challenge that exists is therefore to understand these interactions in order to properly evaluate whether the added costs of policies justify their added benefit. And this really underscores the importance of periodic review and flexibility in the policy framework so that policymakers can assess whether policies are meeting their intended goals, and so that they can be adjusted over time. And that concludes the Canadian case study. I'll just wrap up for the presentation as a whole. Carbon pricing plays a critical role in the policy mix for energy sector low carbon transition, but it's a complex exercise to understand exactly the role that it plays in energy transition and how it layers with other policies. Even a high carbon price doesn't address all the aspects of energy transition, as we mentioned. So other policies making up a comprehensive policy package are needed, which vary by energy subsector and vary over time. In terms of next steps in this work program, the IEA is planning a project next year with China's NDRC, Department of Climate Change. Firstly, to map China's low carbon policy mix, and then secondly, to understand what the interactions are, particularly with the forthcoming national emissions trading system with the wider energy sector and energy sector policies. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Peter and Caroline. It was great to have an overview and a little bit of some insight into what's on the paper. You hopefully all have the link to that paper now, and you know the presentation materials will also be posted afterwards on the website, so don't worry about that. So we have sort of taken a bit more time as usual than we planned. So, and there's been quite a few questions. We will, of course, we can try and answer them even after the webinar in writing some of them. But maybe just two questions, one that's a bit broader and then one that's a bit narrower. So there's been a few questions that touch on this issue of what kind of insights can we have on how policy packages can address broader issues, broader policy issues. So, for example, sort of systemic challenges to energy transition, and how can policymakers actually help some of those deeper, perhaps more resistant changes rather than just a little bit here and there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key narrative or the sort of key lens throughout which we looked at the problematic of a real world policy packages is the different objectives and constraints that the countries will face with respect to transforming the energy systems in a profound manner. And we did not go into the depth trying to estimate or trying to explore how different objectives or transformational objectives drive different policy packages, but we're very much aware of different structural constraints within countries, whether this is with respect to industrial inheritance, or this would be the natural resource endowment, and how will this impact prioritization of the elements of the transition, and what different aspects are there. Notwithstanding, I think we are of a view that all the different key domains within the policy packages need to be explored within different environments, and specific natural circumstances will then determine what the particular transition looks like.
I would add too that this is one element that we would like to explore in this forthcoming work stream in China, to look at how policy, really this transformative structural changes in China, how they link to low carbon policy packages, and how in particular, as these structural adjustments take place, how we can make sure that the policy goals in China are still met as the low carbon transition evolves. So this is something that we would like to certainly explore in the future.
Okay. And there's one other specific question which might be interesting given the case study, is on the importance of integration and alignment between the national and subnational level. And Caroline, you discussed this a bit. How important is that to be able to design and implement these kind of packages that are more realistic and have real impact and can lead to real changes?
So as I mentioned, the history of Canada is very interesting. The history of Canada, really, the history of low carbon policy development in Canada is very interesting. Whereas I mentioned, it's really the subnational jurisdictions that have driven the low carbon policy agenda for the last decade. So in fact, low carbon policy agenda has been quite uncoordinated at the federal level. And this has not been necessarily problematic, as I say, because low carbon policy packages have been able to be tailored to local circumstances. And because there's such a large variety in the energy sectors of particular regions, in the political priorities of different regions, it's allowed each province to have a policy package, again, that's customized to their own circumstances. There has also been, as I mentioned, an absence of federal drivers of climate policy. So the fact that there has been this rather uncoordinated action taking place at the subnational level has allowed the transition agenda to progress in the absence of, again, drivers at the federal level. So it's not such a bad thing. The costs really come from the lack of coordination, where there might be increased costs, as I mentioned, because of different explicit carbon prices across the countries, which creates inconsistent policy signals for players across the country. Canada shows, I think, a very interesting approach to how you can kind of do both. So make sure that, again, subnational jurisdictions can have a customized policy packages to their own national circumstance, but make sure that there is a level of harmonization and coordination at the federal level to be able to reduce costs and also raise ambition across the country. And certainly I encourage you to read the case study to get more detail on that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's really interesting. There's really interesting insights looking at that kind of alignment and yeah, what you're talking about, the advantages and disadvantages, and that will probably play out in different jurisdictions that have different kind of national, subnational relationships as well. We have had other questions. You see Peter and Caroline's email addresses online. We're aware that we've already taken up more of your time than planned, and thank you so much for so many of you for staying with us for this entire time. But we will need to cut the webinar at this point. We're already about 5 minutes over. So just want to encourage you to please take a look at the paper, get in touch with the authors. As Caroline mentioned, we're continuing to do work in this area, and specific work on China that's going to be happening next year. So do stay in touch and do send your questions along, and we're very happy to engage on this topic. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.